Hey everyone, welcome to the program WRSA Radio. I am your host, Grenadier One. As always, I hope you're having a good week. It's been a very busy one for me, so I'm honestly kind of surprised I got this episode together, but I finally got motivated to do this one, and it's been sort of a relatively quiet week on the national news front. Things have happened, of course, but they are largely already falling off the news cycle as I put this together, and we've got some new things kind of developing. But it's not really worth putting a lot of time to comment on things that are kind of already past at this point. So I wanted to spend the show today delivering on the leadership topic, a leadership episode that I've been talking about for a few shows now. So a couple of shows back, I gave an intro of sorts that outlined what I thought a good leader should display in terms of style and characteristics. And this week I'm going to provide an example of that in the form of one Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Now, let me preface this by saying that this is in no way a detailed examination of the man or his life and career. Okay, what this is and what subsequent episodes will be in this topic, in this sort of series of shows, is really just teasers and examples. I just don't have the format here for making, a long form documentary on any of these individuals. At any rate, what I want to do here is to just give you some examples, some details, some things that just kind of illustrate the point, and encourage you, the viewer or listener, to go forward and kind of read or watch more on your own. Go out there, find your own documentaries or your own books, research on your own. Not necessarily research. I think that term gets kind of overused and thrown around a little too much these days. But, just explore the person a little bit more in your own time. I'm leading you to water, but you have to drink it on your own. So there's just only so much I can fit into like a 20 or 30 minute episode of this show. And if I try to do something sort of as a special episode and turn it into like an hour or more, people tend to just not really have the patience for those kind of things, sadly, these days. I don't necessarily get that myself, but I understand it. So trying to deliver some product here without over complicating things. So with that out of the way, let's get into the man. Okay, Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel, born November the 15th, 1891, in the area of Swabia, which is at that time, part of the Duchy of Württemberg, and he was born to a father that was a schoolmaster and a mother who was of a noble family. She was a von, if you know the details of that in Germany. And he was, by all accounts, a Swabian through and through. He was stable and solid and level-headed, careful with money and very prudent. And while Rommel did display panache and kind of a flair for the theatrical, he had common sense and he had shrewdness and all of the characteristics of his people. He went to cadet school and joined his first regiment in 1910, and that was the 124th Württemberg Infantry. At the time, there was a system in place that cadets, he's called a cadet at this point in the literature, but it's really more like, you might think of it more equivalent to our ROTC. And he's expected to join a regiment and experience life as a junior officer or an NCO and gain, the approval of his fellow officers or his future fellow officers and the men prior to going off to a formal school setting. So there's this very internal weeding out process that a regiment did, which made sure that when the young man came back from the schoolroom, he was already accepted among the men and officers. And Rommel leaves the regiment in March of 1911 and he to go off to school in Danzig, and he returns in early 1912 as a commissioned officer. Now, I bring this background up to just point out that Rommel is a product of an entire system here, a culture, and he's certainly outstanding among it, but it's this experience that helps form and shape his leadership as an adult. He is intrinsic and in this entire culture of the German Empire at the time, Prussia. And he goes into the First World War as an infantry officer. He was a reserve officer for a while. Obviously, they were not at war prior to the big conflict there when World War I kicks off. And he goes into the regiment, and he proceeds to cover himself and his units with glory. Okay. After the war, he writes about his commands and his accounts, and this experience in a book. And what is more important, however, is that in the course of writing this book, it's more important in my opinion, at least, he's using his diary as a source and the regimental records, and he adds additional notes and observations at points in the book in each segment in the text. And he does his own after-action analysis, which talks about lessons learned during the specific things that he's recounting, which I think is very unique, very important, and it's a way you get insight into not only the things that he's writing about, but his internal process of analyzing it after the fact. And the book is published in Germany. It's called Infantry Attacks, and it becomes a huge hit in military circles, and not only in the what were called the Central Powers countries, but in the Allied countries as well. In English-speaking countries, it's published, but there are redactions that are made, and those redactions remove lines and analysis that is deemed to be overly critical of the Allies, and it's published with the same name, Infantry Attacks, even with these redactions. And the book is read very heavily in Western, I say Western, Germany's a Western country now, but back then I don't think they would have called it that. But in the U.S., in particular in England and France and the U.S., U.S. Army officers circle it around pretty heavily. And as you may have seen in the movie about him, General George Patton just gobbled this book up. Okay, he read it many times. He knew whole sections by heart. He was a student of this work. Now I have a copy of this book, and I've read it a couple of times, and it's fantastic. And I'm going to refer to it really for the rest of the show here to highlight some of the things about Rommel that I think demonstrate those characteristics that I think are vital in a good leader. One thing of note, there is a more modern published version of the original book without all of the redactions that is available in English, and it is simply titled Attacks, but it includes the full text translated. And I have a copy of this as well, and I did some quick scanning between both versions. I can't really tell what the difference is. It's sort of, they're kind of buried. They're not these huge standout like, oh, this entire chapter is missing or anything like that. It's just certain passages. The layout is a little bit different, and the page count, it's really indicative, of certain pieces of material being removed. Although I suspect it's not really the tactical details that are missing. It's more of that analysis and sort of the critical aspects of really probably the French and the British in the early parts of the book that are probably taken out. No one really cared how critical he was of the Italians and the Romanians. But anyway, and that gets me to the course of the war for Rommel. Early on, he's with an infantry company from that Württemberg infantry regiment. And they're involved in the initial conflict in France. Now, this is in advance of the trench warfare that is characteristics of the war that we think of when we think of World War I. Although he does see some trench fighting in the Argonne, as the advances kind of stall. This is mainly still when the war is very fluid and mobile, and it more resembles what we see later in World War II at that beginning stage of things. But then he's transferred to Romania, and he ends the war fighting Romanian and Italian mountain troops. He spends most of this time in that theater, the Carpathians and those mountain areas, for the predominantly for the whole conflict. And it's here that he really learns things that are going to pay him well into the future. He learns to place emphasis on terrain. As you can imagine, in a mountain setting, terrain is extremely important, and he learns this to a T. And he learns to use deception where he can. He learns to be frugal with logistics, and he has spare no expense when it comes to reconnaissance. He becomes very, very emphatic about reconnaissance. And above all, he earns the respect from his men because they trust that he has their lives in mind and he has their interest at hand when he carefully plans operations and makes sure that he's not, throwing their lives away. And this is, not something that was a given at that time. Often we hear about World War I as being a war that needlessly threw away the lives of millions of men in very pointless offensives that really had no hope of success. We see that time and time again, particularly from the French. That's an accurate depiction, I think, to a large extent, but it's not always the case. And there were leaders who were far more diligent with what they were doing, far more meticulous in their planning, and Rommel was one of those. Now, I found some things very telling when reading this book. One of which, and I think it goes towards that quality of loyalty that I marked as a critical aspect of leadership. Not only did his men respect him, but he respected his men. He mentions in almost every engagement in the book that he goes into, he mentions the names of individuals, junior officers and enlisted men, who displayed some form of outstanding performance or sacrifice. And this is not something that he had to do at all in this book. He's writing what is essentially a military text. You could think of it as a type of tactical manual or textbook. He didn't have to put this in here. He could have omitted that level of personal information and kept it, simply to the facts of the actions and the tactical aspects of the specific situations. He names these men and he puts forth their actions because many times, more often than not, those actions go unnoticed. They do not rise to the level of acknowledgement by any kind of official means. They're not called out for people being awarded medals or even mentioned in, many times they're not even mentioned in official records. And I think it's a significant thing that he does here. I think it's a clear indication that he values his men and their accomplishments, and he thinks that they are, they're a major factor in his own success, and as he is a factor in their success. If you mark success as bringing someone alive through the end of the conflict, your actions as a leader contribute to that. They weigh heavily on that. So I think he mentioned these things. It would not shock me to learn if he felt some of these things were failures on his part, that certain individuals did things and lost their lives because of maybe small things that he might have done wrong. That would not shock me at all to learn that. It's a bond, I think, and he's paying his respects to these men to write about them in this book that we're still reading 100 years later. I think that's kind of an amazing thing. The other thing that really comes across here in the book is the quality of his competency. And I laid this out as a case that a leader should be well versed in his craft, and Rommel shows that time after time after time. He is a master already at a very young age in World War I. Now, he's not always successful, but he takes pains to achieve the greatest effect with the least loss of life of his men and in the most efficient way, possible. And on more than one occasion, his men are taking far more prisoners than they are inflicting casualties. Having full commanding knowledge of your craft allows for inspiration and personal initiative that Rommel displays over and over again, well into his career in World War II, because he knows his work, he can adapt very quickly to a changing environment, the dynamic situation. When his plans run headlong into the actions of the enemy, they always say the enemy gets a vote, right? So when you know what you're doing, you can very quickly change, your plan and adapt to that changing environment. And he's showing you this in World War I, and he demonstrates it on a high level already, and like I said, much later at a much higher level in World War II. He's risen through the ranks and he's commanding much larger formations, and he continues to do this. And his men continue to perform at a very high level against all kinds of odds there. So another aspect that Rommel displays, I think, is trust. He trusts his men, both the enlisted as well as the NCOs and junior officers. And he allows them to display personal initiative and flex their own leadership in their roles. This is something very Prussian, by the way. That is something that carries on into World War II, and they have an entire name for it. It's an entire style of command and leadership. I talked a little bit about it in the episode that I mentioned before. So it's not entirely surprising that he would be this way, but I think he's exemplary in this. There's an example with an NCO during that campaign in Romania, and at one point he's commanding what he calls it's called a detachment in the translation. We would probably know it more as a Kampfgruppe today, as that name has become more known in the West. It's roughly a small battalion, 2 rifle companies and a machine gun company, and they are attacking an Italian position along this mountain ridge. And they've circled around, and they're basically coming into the Italians' flank and rear area without the Italians knowing that this is happening. And this is very classic Rommel, by the way. It's this boldness and aggressiveness, but he comes to a point where they are close to an Italian gun position, and he pulls this very large, very hulking NCO out of the ranks, and he tells him to grab 8 men and just go up this trail and approach the Italians like you are, friendly soldiers coming in from a patrol. He tells him that, they'll be ready to support them if necessary, but that he should do what he can to take the position by surprise and not fire a shot. So he sends this NCO and his squad off, and he's kind of waiting, okay, not sure that this is going to work, but pretty soon one of these squad mates comes running back down the hill and tells him that they've taken the position and they've moved on to take the next position in the same fashion. This ends up leading to the fall of the entire Italian situation there in that mountain area. They're forced to give up this terrain feature as their positions are captured because it just unhinges them. They just cannot keep the position. And there's another example from the same action that I think highlights his attention to detail and also his attention to the well-being of his men. As I said, he has a machine gun company under his command. And when they are on this approach march for this attack, he points out that he adjusts the order of march so that the machine gun company is setting the pace for the entire group. He knows the value of having these guns in the attack and the need for the gunners to be fresh and capable when the time comes to employ them. And he knows that they are carrying a heavier load of kit than the normal rifleman. So he allows them to set the pace of walking and climbing these trails and ridges. They're carrying like 90 pounds, he says, some of the guys. Now, a different commander might have taken, different steps there. He might have relegated those machine guns to the rear of the column so that the riflemen could move at an accelerated pace. And then at the time of action, because these gunners were either not caught up and not in position, or maybe they're too tired to efficiently use or emplace their guns, he might have really impacted and diminished the role that they would play in an attack. And both of those decisions would have led to excess casualties. And again, I think this illustrates just critical aspects of leadership on Rommel's part. He knows what he's doing, he knows his craft, and he knows that taking care of his men is going to pay dividends in the end. So, again, just time after time after time, he displays these characteristics. That's where I want to stop here because, as I said, I want you to go out and do the reading on your own time so you can absorb really more of this man and his accomplishments. He's a very great historical figure, although, like many others, he falls into a category that they're often overshadowed, what they really were and did. They're judged by who they served and the flag they served under more than their individual merits and virtues, unfortunately. That's the main reason I wanted to limit what I covered in this to really more of his service in World War I, so that we, avoid getting into the weeds of the political aspects of World War II. I recommend getting yourself a copy of Attacks, the unabridged version or the unredacted version, and giving it more than one read. Okay, there's a lot to absorb there. There are lessons that are applicable to modern conflict, but also applicable to our personal lives. And once again, I urge the adage of knowing the way broadly. If you're interested in more of a biographical work about him, I recommend a book called Knight's Cross by David Fraser. It's a massive book. It's about 560 pages, and it covers his whole life in detail. I have not finished reading that book, but so far it's been a pretty good read. So it is very meticulous, very very intricate. Okay, so I hope you gained something from this. I plan to do additional leaders examples in the future, so I hope you look forward to those episodes. Let me know what you think down in the comments. That's all I have time for today. Like and subscribe. Come see us over on Gab and the Mothership, and I will see you on the next episode.